President Trump praised Florida lawmakers for their response to Hurricane Dorian this week. Mr. Trump specifically called out Governor Ron DeSantis and Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott. Before Dorian brought intense wind and rain to Florida, Senator Scott weighed in on whether he sees a connection between climate change and the strength of storms.
Well, first off, we know the climate's changing, and we know our storms seem to be getting bigger. I mean, just in the last 4 years as governor, I had 4 of them. And now we have them my first year out as governor. So we don't know what the cause is, but we've got to react to it. So as governor...
And Jim Defede joins me now from Miami. He's an investigative reporter at our station, WFOR. Jim, welcome. So how does Senator Scott's stance on climate change now compare to how he treated the issue while he was governor of Florida?
Well, during his time as governor, the words climate change were forbidden from being used in the administration in any sort of way. They never put out any scientific reports or anything along that lines. It was just verboten. And so what you're seeing now is, and you're seeing this among other Republicans as well, they're acknowledging that climate is changing. Where they don't want to get into is a discussion of why it's changing and the role that man might play in it. But the fact that there was some admission on the governor's part that climate is changing, that was seen as a pretty dramatic step even for him.
It does seem as if Florida Republicans may be on the cutting edge of change in the Republican Party when it comes to discussing climate change. Let's talk about the state's new governor, Ron DeSantis. How has he specifically been talking about climate change?
So he's actually willing to sort of embrace the issue a lot more than his predecessor. Again, he doesn't like to use the term climate change. He doesn't really want to talk about man's influence or fluorocarbons or whether or not we need to be doing things like cap and trade or anything else. He wants to stay away from that. But what Governor DeSantis has done is he's brought science back into the equation to some extent. He's hired a chief science officer for the state of Florida, a chief resilience officer, to talk about how to handle the effects of climate change. No matter what the cause is, he says, what you need to do is start planning ahead to deal with what's going to happen as sea level rises. So, you know, here in Florida, by the way, we've seen now 5 Category 5 hurricanes in the last 3 years. That's in 3 years, 5 Category 5 hurricanes have come through the Atlantic. That's, you know, it's hard to start denying that the storms are getting worse and more intense, and so politicians are having to respond to it.
And then another Florida Republican politician, Senator Marco Rubio, wrote an op-ed before Dorian came close to Florida. He said, yes, the climate is changing, but that there's no cause for alarm. And you asked him about that.
Climate has always been changing. Climate is changing now. And there's a lot of debate about the causes and what percentage of it is due to human activity versus something else. I think clearly human activity contributes to it, along with a lot of other factors as well, including the fact that climate's always adjusting. What's not in dispute is the impact that it's having.
So in Senator Rubio's op-ed, he said many proposed fixes for climate change have been unrealistic and dangerous. So what specifically is Senator Rubio proposing instead?
So again, here you see this chasm that's being created where Republicans and Democrats talk about the issue differently. Again, for Senator Rubio, as with Senator Scott and Governor DeSantis, they are now willing to admit, yes, the climate is changing. They don't want to talk about the cause because that gets them into a discussion of having to try to counter the cause, having to try to deal with hydrofluorocarbons going into the atmosphere. They don't want to have that discussion. Instead, what Senator Rubio is proposing is adaptation. Coming up with ways to deal with the rising sea levels and the impacts of climate change. And what's fascinating about this is what he's trying to do is make it seem, the word that he used in his op-ed was manageable. These things are manageable. We don't need to go to extreme solutions proposed by elites on the Democratic left. You know, he's specifically talking about the Green New Deal. He's not a fan of that. He's saying that we can manage this. But when I pressed him for answers about what that meant to be managing this crisis, he cites a 2017 EPA study, and adaptation is the cornerstone of that study, where it talks about how if we do find certain measures that we can adapt, we can mitigate the damage caused by rising sea levels. But when you get into the specifics, for instance, one of the things that adaptation means that Senator Rubio doesn't want to have the public discussion about is that you're going to have to start abandoning certain parts of the state. In Miami alone, over the next 80 years, they anticipate $57 billion worth of property is going to have to be abandoned. You're going to have to make the decision to no longer rebuild, to just give it up. In the Tampa Bay area, it's $63 billion would have to be given up. So those are the types of discussions that are a lot harder to have. Also, when you talk about climate change and climate sea level rise, you know, what you're not talking about are the effects of things like the hurricanes that we're seeing, the more intense storms. You're also seeing higher heat. That EPA report that he cited has higher death tolls as a result. You also have issues like West Nile virus being increased 10 or 20-fold in the coming years because of it. Right. And you're going to see an increase in toxic blue-green algae.
Well, Florida, no doubt, is on the front lines of a lot of all of this that's being caused by climate change. So it's not surprising that Florida Republicans are the first to have to sort of adapt their rhetoric to it. But overall, how important do you think climate change has been to voters in Florida?
I think it is an increasing issue. I don't think that these Republican leaders would be moving as they are, even if it's at a glacial pace, but at least moving in that direction if they didn't also see that voters were heading that way as well. You have generally bipartisan consensus that the issues of sea level rise is affecting communities up and down Florida's coast. That's the one thing that is galvanizing both Democrats and Republicans. So I do think is an important issue. Now, whether or not folks in Florida would support the Green New Deal, whether or not they would support some of the more extreme proposals offered by those on the Democratic side, that I'm not sure of. But they certainly want politicians who are acknowledging the problem and offering solutions to deal with it.
You talked about at one point abandoning property, right, that it might come to that point. So imagine that who has to make that decision. That is not going to be a popular political decision at any level. So those are the sorts of policy decisions you can imagine won't ever get made.
Well, they may be made for them. At some point in the future, if a Category 5 hurricane were to hit and annihilate, say, Marathon in the Florida Keys or some other community on the eastern seaboard of Florida, there has to be a decision made, will you rebuild? And some of that may be made by the private sector. Will insurance companies agree to actually finance? Will banks offer mortgages? You know, one of the more telling things that you're going to see in the years ahead is that I think who's really going to determine what properties are salvageable and which ones aren't are going to be the banks.
No 30-year mortgages for you.
Because they're going to make the decision as to whether or not to give. Exactly. The day that Bank of America or Wells Fargo or any of those banks decide that certain areas are no longer creditworthy for 30-year mortgages, that's going to be a real bellwether.
You're right. All right. Well, Jim Defede, thank you so much for talking to us about what's going on there in Florida. Thank you so much.